The pen trembled in Mia's hand as she watched me from across the classroom, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against her desk in that familiar rhythm that meant she was about to destroy my life. Again. But this time, I was ready for her. Elena, could you please come to the front? Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through the morning chatter, and I felt every pair of eyes in advanced literature turn toward me. 23 pairs, to be exact. I'd counted them in my previous life, when this same moment had shattered my world so completely that I'd ended up taking my own life 3 months later. I stood slowly, letting my chair scrape against the floor with deliberate emphasis. Mia's eyes widened slightly. She wasn't expecting my calm reaction. In the original timeline, I'd been confused, panicked, desperately trying to understand why our teacher was calling me up with that disappointed expression etched across her weathered face. Yes, Mrs. Henderson? I kept my voice steady, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. The familiar weight of betrayal sat heavy in my chest, but underneath it was something new. Anticipation. Sweet, burning anticipation. Mrs. Henderson held up 2 essays, and I could see Mia stiffen in my peripheral vision. The papers looked identical from where I stood, but I knew exactly what was written on them. Every word, every carefully crafted argument, every supposedly original insight that had taken me weeks to develop. I'm afraid we need to discuss your essay on the symbolism of light in Victorian literature. Mrs. Henderson's voice carried that particular tone teachers used when they were about to deliver devastating news. There seems to be a rather serious issue. I nodded, fighting the urge to smile. What kind of issue? Plagiarism. The word hung in the air like a blade. Several students gasped, and I heard Jake Morrison whisper "holy shit" under his breath before catching himself. This was it. The exact moment that had begun my descent into hell in my first life. The moment my perfect GPA had been destroyed, my college applications ruined, my parents' trust shattered. The moment Mia had orchestrated so perfectly that even I had almost believed I was guilty. But I wasn't 17 and naive anymore. Technically, I was 17 again. The universe had seen fit to give me that cruel joke of a second chance. But my mind held 23 years of memories, including the vivid recollection of dying alone in a dingy apartment, overdosed on pills because I couldn't bear the weight of everyone believing I was a cheater and a fraud. I see, I said, and Mrs. Henderson blinked, clearly expecting more of a reaction. Behind her, I could see the morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the classroom floor. In my previous life, I'd focused on those shadows, trying to disappear into them as my world crumbled. Now, they just looked like ordinary shadows. Elena, do you understand the severity of this accusation? Mrs. Henderson's voice softened slightly, and I remembered how she'd tried to be kind, even as she'd been forced to destroy my academic career. She genuinely liked me, which had made the betrayal cut deeper. Yes, ma'am, I understand completely. I glanced back at Mia, who was watching our exchange with barely contained excitement. She'd spent months planning this moment, stealing my rough drafts, copying my handwriting, even going so far as to use the same paper I preferred for my final submissions. She'd thought of everything, everything except the one detail that would ultimately destroy her. Mrs. Henderson gestured for me to approach her desk. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to explain how your essay came to be identical to another student's work. Word for word, Elena. Even the handwriting appears to match. I walked forward, my footsteps echoing in the suddenly silent classroom. 23 pairs of eyes followed my movement, and I could practically feel the weight of their judgment, their shock, their disappointment. In my first life, this moment had crushed me. The whispers that had followed, the way my classmates had looked at me like I was some kind of pariah, the shame that had burned in my chest like acid. Now I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. May I see both papers? I asked, extending my hand. Mrs. Henderson hesitated, then handed them over. I held them up, studying them with theatrical concentration. They were perfect copies, down to the last punctuation mark. Mia had always been meticulous, even in her cruelty. This is very interesting, I said, loud enough for the entire class to hear. The handwriting does look remarkably similar, doesn't it? A murmur ran through the classroom. Someone, I thought it might be Sarah Chen, made a small sound of disbelief. I handed the papers back to Mrs. Henderson and turned to face the class, letting my gaze sweep over each face before settling on Mia. She was sitting perfectly straight, her expression a masterpiece of concerned confusion. Her long blonde hair fell in perfect waves over her shoulders, and her blue eyes, our father's eyes, the ones everyone always said were so much prettier than my plain brown ones, were wide with what looked like innocent shock. I think, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room, that Mrs. Henderson should take a very close look at both pieces of handwriting with a magnifying glass, if possible. The second those words left my mouth, I saw Mia's face go white. Just a flash, barely perceptible, but I caught it. She knew exactly what I was talking about. Because Mia had always had one fatal flaw. She was left-handed and I was right-handed. When she'd copied my work, she'd done an admirable job mimicking my letter formation, my spacing, even the particular way I dotted my I's and crossed my T's. But the slant was wrong. The pressure was wrong. The microscopic details that revealed the true hand behind the pen were wrong. Mrs. Henderson had always prided herself on her attention to detail. In my previous life, she'd simply assumed the identical content meant I'd copied from someone else. She'd been so focused on the matching words that she'd never bothered to analyze the handwriting itself. But I'd just given her reason to look closer. That's actually not a bad idea, Mrs. Henderson said slowly, studying the papers with renewed interest. Elena, are you suggesting that someone copied your handwriting as well as your content? I shrugged, the picture of innocence. I'm just suggesting that maybe things aren't exactly what they appear to be. And that was when everything from my first life came flooding back, washing over me like a tide of bitter memory. I'd been 15 when my parents divorced, and 16 when my father remarried Clara, a woman 10 years younger than him with a daughter just 6 months older than me. Mia had been beautiful, popular, and absolutely furious that her mother's new marriage meant she had to share her space and attention with another teenager. From the moment I'd moved into their sprawling suburban home, Mia had made it clear that I was an unwelcome intruder. It had started small, my clothes going missing from the laundry, my homework assignments disappearing from my backpack, accidents that left me soaked or covered in food just before important events. But Mia was clever. She never did anything that could be definitively traced back to her. When my favorite sweater ended up ruined with bleach, she'd been at cheerleading practice. When my science project got destroyed the night before it was due, she'd been at a sleepover. When my diary ended up photocopied and distributed around school, revealing my most embarrassing secrets, she'd been the first person to comfort me, her arms around my shoulders as she whispered how sorry she was that someone would do such a terrible thing. My father, desperate to make his new marriage work, had chosen to believe that teenage girls were just dramatic. My stepmother, Clara, had been too busy trying to manage her own guilt about breaking up my parents' marriage to notice that her daughter was systematically destroying my life. And my own mother, drowning in her own bitterness about the divorce, had become increasingly unavailable, viewing my complaints about Mia as just another burden she didn't have the energy to handle. The worst part was how good Mia was at it. She'd perfected the art of plausible deniability, always ensuring that her cruelty looked like coincidence or accident. She'd smile sweetly at family dinners while systematically isolating me from friends, sabotaging my relationships, and undermining my confidence at every turn. By my senior year, I'd become a ghost in my own life. My grades were excellent. That was the one thing Mia couldn't take from me, or so I'd thought. But I had no friends, no social life, no confidence. I'd learned to keep my head down to avoid drawing attention, to make myself as small and invisible as possible in hopes that maybe, just maybe, she'd get bored and leave me alone. The plagiarism accusation had been her masterpiece. She'd spent months preparing for it, stealing my rough drafts, studying my writing process, even practicing my handwriting until she could forge it well enough to fool a casual observer. She'd waited until the most important essay of the semester, the one that would largely determine our final grades, the one that could make or break our college applications. I'd worked on that essay for 3 weeks, crafting every sentence, researching every reference, pouring my heart and soul into an analysis that I genuinely believed was insightful and original. I'd been proud of it, one of the few things in my life I'd felt genuinely good about. And then Mia had destroyed it all with surgical precision. The accusation had come just 2 days before college application deadlines. Mrs. Henderson, faced with two identical essays and no clear way to determine who had copied from whom, had been forced to give us both zeros and report the incident to the administration. My perfect GPA had been shattered. My college applications had been flagged. Even when the investigation couldn't definitively prove I was the guilty party, the shadow of suspicion had followed me. My father had been disappointed but not entirely surprised. He'd already been primed by years of Mia's subtle suggestions that I was jealous, troubled, prone to acting out. Clara had been sympathetic but helpless, caught between loyalty to her daughter and fairness to me. My mother had been furious, but her anger had been directed at me for embarrassing her, rather than at the situation itself. The worst part had been the isolation. My few remaining friends had pulled away, unsure whether to believe in my innocence. My teachers had looked at me with suspicion and disappointment. The college counselor had been forced to withdraw several recommendation letters. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd dreamed of, had crumbled in a matter of days. Mia, meanwhile, had played her role perfectly. She'd publicly defended me, telling anyone who would listen how sorry she felt for me, how she couldn't believe someone would accuse me of such a thing. Privately, she'd made sure I knew exactly who was responsible, dropping little hints and smirks when no one else was watching. The final straw had come 3 months later when I'd discovered that not only had she orchestrated the plagiarism accusation, but she'd also been systematically sabotaging my life in ways I'd never even realized. She'd been intercepting letters from colleges, deleting emails from potential friends, even going so far as to call boys I'd had crushes on and pretend to be me while saying humiliating things. That night, I'd taken every pill I could find in the medicine cabinet and gone to sleep, hoping never to wake up. But I had woken up, in the same bed, in the same room, in the same house, with the same family that had failed to protect me. Except it was 6 months earlier, and I had the chance to do everything differently. The first few weeks had been disorienting. I'd moved through my daily routine like a sleepwalker, trying to process the impossible reality of being 17 again, while retaining the memories and perspective of my 23-year-old self. I'd waited for the universe to correct its mistake, to snap me back to death, or forward to some other timeline. But as the days had turned into weeks, I'd begun to understand that this was real. I was really here, really alive, really given a second chance to navigate the minefield of my senior year. And more importantly, I was given a second chance to deal with Mia. Elena! Mrs. Henderson's voice snapped me back to the present, and I realized I'd been standing in silence for several long moments, lost in memory. Sorry, I said, offering her a small smile. I was just thinking about how to explain this situation. Mrs. Henderson nodded, her expression softening slightly. Take your time. This is obviously a very serious matter. I glanced back at Mia again. She was watching me with barely concealed anxiety now, her perfect composure starting to crack around the edges. She could sense that something was wrong, that my reaction wasn't following the script she'd written. In the original timeline, I'd been desperate to prove my innocence. I'd babbled and pleaded and tried to explain, making myself look more guilty with every word. I'd begged Mrs. Henderson to believe me, to understand that I would never cheat, that the essay was truly my own work. This time, I said nothing. I just waited. The silence stretched between us, heavy with anticipation. I could hear the tick of the classroom clock, the rustle of papers as students shifted in their seats, the distant sound of a lawnmower working on the school grounds outside. Finally, Mrs. Henderson spoke. Elena, I'm going to need you to stay after class so we can discuss this in more detail. I want to examine both essays more carefully, and I think it would be helpful to have you write a brief statement explaining your process for this assignment. Of course, I agreed readily. Whatever you need. The bell rang then, signaling the end of the first period, and the classroom erupted into motion. Students gathered their belongings and headed for the door, but not before shooting curious glances in my direction. I could already hear the whispers starting, the speculation, the gossip that would spread through the school like wildfire. But this time I wasn't afraid. This time, I knew exactly how the story would end. Mia approached Mrs. Henderson's desk as the last students filed out, her expression a perfect mask of concern and confusion. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm so sorry about all this," she said, her voice soft and sympathetic. "I can't imagine how someone could do something so awful to Elena. She's always been such a good student." I had to admire the performance. Mia had always been a gifted actress, able to project whatever emotion the situation required. Right now, she was the picture of a concerned stepsister, worried about my well-being and shocked by the accusations against me. Mrs. Henderson looked between us, her brow furrowed with concern. "Mia, I'm glad you're here. I was hoping to speak with both of you about this situation." Both of us. Mia's voice carried just the right note of confusion, as if she couldn't imagine why she would be involved in a discussion about my alleged plagiarism. "Yes." Mrs. Henderson reached for the two essays, holding them up side by side. "You see, the other essay, the one Elena supposedly copied from, was submitted by you." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and I watched as Mia's mask slipped for just a fraction of a second. There it was. The flash of panic, the momentary widening of her eyes, the almost imperceptible intake of breath that revealed her guilt. But she recovered quickly, as she always did. Me. She pressed a hand to her chest, the picture of innocent shock. "But that's impossible. I wrote my essay on the role of nature in romantic poetry. It's completely different." Mrs. Henderson frowned, shuffling through the papers on her desk. "Are you certain? Because according to my records, this essay on Victorian symbolism was submitted with your name on it." I watched Mia's face carefully, saw the exact moment she realized her mistake. She'd been so focused on copying my work perfectly that she'd forgotten to actually submit her own assignment. In her rush to frame me for plagiarism, she'd accidentally submitted two identical essays under both our names. "There must be some kind of mix-up," Mia said quickly, her voice slightly higher than normal. "Maybe there was an error when you were filing the papers. I definitely wrote about romantic poetry. I spent weeks on it." Mrs. Henderson was studying the essays more intently now, and I could see her sharp eyes catching details that had escaped her notice during the initial review. The slight differences in pen pressure, the subtle variations in letter formation, the telltale signs that one essay had been copied from the other rather than written independently. "This is very strange," Mrs. Henderson murmured, more to herself than to us. "Elena, could you please write a few sentences for me? Just copy this paragraph from the textbook." She pointed to a random passage, and I dutifully transcribed it, making sure to use the same natural writing style I always employed. My letters flowed smoothly from my pen, each one formed with the unconscious muscle memory of years of practice. "Now, Mia, if you could do the same." I saw Mia hesitate just for a moment. She knew she was in trouble now, knew that her carefully constructed plan was unraveling. But she had no choice but to comply, so she picked up a pen and began to write. The difference was immediately apparent. Where my handwriting slanted naturally to the right, reflecting my right-handed grip, Mia's letters tilted slightly leftward despite her obvious attempt to mimic my style. The spacing was different, the pressure inconsistent, the flow disrupted by the conscious effort required to forge someone else's natural patterns. Mrs. Henderson examined both samples with a magnifying glass she kept in her desk drawer, the same magnifying glass she used to analyze historical documents and verify the authenticity of student work. I'd suggested she use it, knowing it would reveal the truth that had been invisible during a cursory examination. The silence stretched for what felt like hours as Mrs. Henderson compared the handwriting samples to the two essays. I could see her expression changing as the evidence became clear, her confusion giving way to understanding, and then to barely controlled anger. Finally, she looked up at Mia, her eyes hard as steel. "Miss Chen," she said formally, using Mia's last name in a way that immediately signaled the shift from teacher-student casualness to official disciplinary action. "I think we need to have a very serious conversation about academic integrity." Mia's composure finally cracked completely. "I don't understand what you're implying," she said, but her voice was shaking now, and her face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "I'm implying," Mrs. Henderson said coldly, "that you copied Elena's essay and submitted it as your own work. The handwriting analysis makes it clear that the essay with your name on it was written by Elena's hand, not yours. Furthermore, I'm beginning to suspect that this was a deliberate attempt to frame Elena for plagiarism by making it appear that she had copied from you. The accusation hit the air like a thunderbolt, and I saw Mia flinch, as if she'd been physically struck. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. In her carefully orchestrated plan, I was supposed to be the one standing here, stammering and desperate, trying to prove my innocence, while she played the role of the innocent victim. That's ridiculous, Mia said, but her voice lacked conviction now. Why would I do something like that? Mrs. Henderson's expression was arctic. That's an excellent question, Miss Chen. Why would you do something like that? I decided it was time to speak. Mrs. Henderson, if I may suggest something? Both women turned to look at me, and I could see the desperation in Mia's eyes. She knew I was about to destroy her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. I think you should check the timestamps on our computer files, I said calmly. I always save multiple drafts as I work, and I'm sure the metadata will show exactly when each version was created. This was the detail that would seal Mia's fate. In my previous life, no one had thought to check the digital evidence. But I remembered exactly when I'd written each section of my essay, when I'd made each revision, when I'd created the final draft. The computer files would show a clear timeline of development, proving not only that I'd written the original work, but that Mia had accessed my files days later to copy them. Mrs. Henderson nodded grimly. That's an excellent suggestion, Elena, Miss Chen. I'm going to need you to provide access to your computer files immediately. I don't think that's necessary, Mia stammered. This is all just a big misunderstanding. Maybe Elena and I accidentally worked from the same sources or something. The same sources don't produce word-for-word identical essays, Miss Chen, Mrs. Henderson said sharply, and they certainly don't explain why your handwriting sample doesn't match the essay submitted under your name. I watched as Mia's world began to crumble, just as mine had crumbled in the original timeline. The difference was that she deserved everything that was about to happen to her. Mrs. Henderson was already reaching for her phone to call the principal's office. I'm afraid this is going to have to be reported to the administration immediately. Academic dishonesty of this magnitude, particularly with the apparent intent to frame another student, is grounds for immediate suspension pending a full investigation. Wait! Mia's composure finally shattered completely. Please, Mrs. Henderson, you don't understand. I can explain everything. But it was too late for explanations. The evidence was overwhelming. The truth was clear. And Mrs. Henderson was not the type of educator who tolerated academic dishonesty in any form. As I watched Mia's perfect facade finally collapse, I felt a surge of satisfaction so intense it was almost overwhelming. This was what justice felt like. This was what it meant to see the truth finally revealed, to watch the person who had destroyed my life face the consequences of her actions. But this was only the beginning. The plagiarism accusation had been just one part of Mia's campaign against me, and my revenge would be equally comprehensive. She'd spent years systematically dismantling my life, and now it was my turn to return the favor. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Within hours, the administration had not only confirmed that Mia had copied my work, but had also uncovered a disturbing pattern of behavior that stretched back months. The computer forensics revealed that she'd been accessing my files regularly, copying my work and even deleting some of my assignments before I could submit them. But that was just the digital evidence. Once the investigation began in earnest, other things started coming to light. Sarah Chen, no relation to Mia, despite the shared last name, came forward to report that Mia had been spreading rumors about me cheating on tests, claiming she'd seen me looking at other students' papers during exams. The rumors had been subtle, planted carefully among my classmates to create an atmosphere of suspicion around my academic performance. Jake Morrison admitted that Mia had approached him after I'd expressed interest in him, telling him that I'd said disparaging things about him behind his back. She'd manufactured conflicts and misunderstandings, systematically isolating me from potential friends and romantic interests. Mrs. Patterson from the guidance office revealed that Mia had come to her multiple times expressing concern about my mental state, suggesting that I was under too much pressure and might be prone to making poor decisions. She'd been laying groundwork, creating a narrative that would make my eventual academic downfall seem inevitable rather than suspicious. Each revelation was another nail in Mia's coffin, and I watched with cold satisfaction as her carefully constructed image crumbled. The girl who had been voted most likely to succeed, who had been homecoming princess, who had been accepted to 3 Ivy League schools, was revealed to be a calculating manipulator who had built her success on the destruction of others. The school board meeting where her fate was decided was held on a Tuesday evening in late November. I sat in the back row of the packed auditorium, watching as my stepsister faced the consequences of her actions. Her parents, my father and stepmother, sat in the front row, their faces etched with shock and shame. Clara was crying softly, her perfect makeup running down her cheeks as she struggled to comprehend how her daughter had become capable of such calculated cruelty. My father sat stiffly beside her, his jaw clenched with the kind of anger I'd rarely seen from him. For the first time in years, that anger wasn't directed at me. "The evidence is overwhelming," the superintendent said, his voice echoing through the silent auditorium. "Miss Chen has engaged in systematic academic dishonesty, attempted to frame another student for plagiarism, and conducted what can only be described as a sustained campaign of harassment and sabotage against her stepsister." Mia sat at the defendant's table with her head bowed, her perfect blonde hair falling like a curtain around her face. She'd aged years in the past few weeks, the stress of the investigation taking its toll on her flawless complexion and confident demeanor. "Furthermore," the superintendent continued, "the investigation has revealed that Miss Chen's academic record contains multiple instances of questionable work that warrant further examination. Several essays submitted over the past 2 years show suspicious similarities to online sources and other students' work." This was the part I'd been waiting for. The plagiarism accusation against me had been just the tip of the iceberg. Once the administration had started looking closely at Mia's work, they'd discovered that her entire academic career had been built on a foundation of cheating and manipulation. She'd been stealing ideas, copying passages, and even paying other students to write assignments for her. Her impressive GPA, her glowing teacher recommendations, her acceptance to prestigious universities, all of it had been achieved through systematic academic dishonesty. "In light of these findings," the superintendent said, "the board has voted to expel Miss Chen from the school district, effective immediately. Her academic record will be flagged, and all institutions of higher learning that have accepted her for admission will be notified of these findings." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through my bones. Justice. Finally, after years of suffering and silence, watching Mia destroy my life with surgical precision, she was facing the consequences of her actions. But even as I savored the moment of victory, I knew this was still just the beginning. Mia's expulsion was public vindication, proof that I'd been the victim rather than the perpetrator. But the damage she'd done to my life extended far beyond academics, and my revenge would need to be equally comprehensive. The aftermath of the school board meeting was swift and dramatic. Within days, Mia's acceptance to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton had been rescinded. Her full scholarship to Northwestern was revoked. The internship she'd secured at a prestigious law firm was canceled. Her entire future, built on a foundation of lies and stolen achievements, crumbled overnight. Clara tried to enroll Mia in a private school, hoping to salvage something from the wreckage of her daughter's academic career. But word had spread through the educational community, and no reputable institution was willing to accept a student with such a thoroughly documented history of academic dishonesty. My father, meanwhile, was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth about his golden stepdaughter. For years, he'd dismissed my complaints about Mia as teenage drama, choosing to believe that I was jealous and prone to exaggeration. Now, faced with incontrovertible evidence of her systematic cruelty, he was struggling to reconcile the sweet, charming girl he thought he knew with the calculating manipulator she'd revealed herself to be. "I'm so sorry, Elena," he said to me one evening, his voice heavy with guilt and regret. "I should have listened to you. I should have protected you." It was too little, too late, but I accepted his apology with grace. After all, I had bigger plans for my future, and holding grudges against my father would only weigh me down. The real satisfaction came from watching Mia herself. The girl who had once moved through the world with supreme confidence, secure in her ability to manipulate any situation to her advantage, was now broken and desperate. She'd lost everything: her reputation, her future, her sense of self-worth, and she knew that I was responsible for her downfall. But she also knew that she'd brought it all on herself. The final piece of my revenge came in the form of a college acceptance letter that arrived in February. While Mia was struggling to find any institution willing to accept her, I received a full scholarship offer from Stanford University, my first choice school. The irony was perfect. In the original timeline, Mia had been accepted to Stanford while I'd been left with only community college as an option. Now, our positions were completely reversed. I found Mia in her room the day the letter arrived, staring out her window at the garden where we'd played as children, before our parents' marriage had turned us into enemies. She looked fragile and hollow, a shadow of the confident young woman who had once ruled our high school social hierarchy. "Congratulations," she said quietly when I appeared in her doorway. "I heard about Stanford." I didn't respond immediately. For a moment, I just studied her face, trying to reconcile this broken girl with the monster who had made my first life so miserable. "Thank you," I said finally. She turned to look at me then, and I saw tears glistening in her blue eyes. "I know you hate me," she whispered, "and I know I deserve it." "I don't hate you, Mia," I said, and realized with surprise that it was true. "I pity you." The words hit her like a physical blow, and she flinched as if I'd slapped her. Pity was so much worse than hatred, so much more devastating than anger. Pity meant that she wasn't even worth the energy it would take to hate her. "I destroyed my own life," she said, her voice barely audible. "I had everything, and I threw it all away because I couldn't stand the thought of you succeeding." "Yes," I agreed simply, "you did." She broke down then, sobbing with the kind of raw desperation that comes from finally understanding the magnitude of one's mistakes. I watched her cry for a moment, feeling nothing but a distant sense of completion. My revenge was finished. Mia had lost everything she'd valued, everything she'd worked for, everything that had defined her sense of self. She was facing a future of mediocrity and obscurity, while I was heading to one of the most prestigious universities in the country with a full scholarship and unlimited potential. Justice had been served, and it was perfect. 3 months later, I graduated as valedictorian, the honor that should have been mine in the original timeline, but had been stolen by Mia's superior GPA, built on years of academic dishonesty. I stood at the podium in front of my classmates, their families, and the faculty who had once doubted my integrity, and delivered a speech about resilience, truth, and the importance of authentic achievement. Mia wasn't there to hear it. She'd been enrolled in a remedial program at a community college 2 hours away, trying to rebuild her academic record from the ground up. Clara had moved with her, unable to bear the shame and gossip that followed them everywhere in our hometown. My father stayed behind, working on rebuilding our relationship and trying to make amends for the years he'd failed to protect me. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the old resentments threatened to overwhelm me. But I'd learned something important during my second chance at life. Holding on to anger and bitterness only poisoned the person carrying it. I'd had my revenge. Mia had faced the consequences of her actions. The truth had been revealed, and justice had been served. Now it was time to focus on building the life I'd always deserved. Stanford was everything I dreamed it would be and more. I thrived in the competitive academic environment, made genuine friendships for the first time in years, and began to rebuild my sense of self-worth. The girl who had once been so broken by betrayal and manipulation that she'd taken her own life was replaced by a young woman who understood her own value and refused to let anyone diminish it. I majored in psychology with a focus on adolescent development, driven by a desire to understand the kinds of family dynamics that had shaped both Mia and me. I wanted to help other young people who were trapped in toxic situations, to give them the tools and support I'd never had in my first life. During my sophomore year, I received a letter from Mia. It had been forwarded through several addresses before finally reaching me, and the envelope was worn and creased from its long journey. Inside was a single page of handwriting, her real handwriting, left slanted and slightly shaky, nothing like the confident forgery she'd once used to try to destroy me. "Dear Elena," it began, "I know I have no right to contact you, and I understand if you throw this letter away without reading it. But I needed to tell you that I am sorry. Not just for the plagiarism, but for everything. For the years of cruelty, for the systematic way I tried to destroy your life. for the pain I caused you and our family? I've spent the last 2 years in therapy trying to understand why I did the things I did. I've learned that my behavior wasn't just typical sibling rivalry. It was abusive and calculated and wrong. I was jealous of your intelligence and your authenticity, and your ability to succeed without compromising your integrity. Instead of trying to better myself, I chose to tear you down, and I will regret that for the rest of my life. I don't expect forgiveness, I don't even deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I understand now what I did to you, and I'm working every day to become a better person. I'll never be able to undo the damage I caused, but I can at least make sure I never hurt anyone else the way I hurt you. I hope you're happy. I hope Stanford is everything you dreamed it would be. You deserve all the success and joy that life has to offer, and I'm genuinely glad that you found it. Your sister, if I can still call myself that, Mia. I read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in a box with other important documents. It was a good apology specific, taking full responsibility, focused on my experience rather than her own guilt. It was the kind of apology I'd never expected to receive from the girl who had once been so committed to my destruction. But I didn't write back. Some wounds were too deep for apologies to heal completely, and some relationships were too damaged to ever be fully repaired. I could forgive Mia for my own peace of mind, but that didn't mean I wanted her back in my life. By my senior year at Stanford, I'd been accepted to graduate programs in psychology at several top-tier universities. I chose to stay at Stanford for my PhD, working with a professor who specialized in family trauma and adolescent resilience. My research focused on the long-term effects of sibling abuse and the factors that contributed to recovery and post-traumatic growth. It was deeply personal work, but also necessary. I wanted to understand not just what had happened to me, but why some people survived and thrived after trauma, while others were crushed by it. I wanted to develop interventions that could help young people trapped in situations similar to what I'd experienced. The girl who had once been so isolated and friendless that she'd taken her own life was now surrounded by colleagues, mentors, and friends who valued her intelligence, integrity, and compassion. I'd learned to trust again, to open my heart to people who deserved that trust, and to protect myself from those who didn't. I even found love, something that had seemed impossible in my first life, when Mia's manipulations had destroyed every potential relationship before it could begin. David was a fellow graduate student in the neuroscience program, brilliant and kind and utterly incapable of the sort of manipulation and cruelty that had defined my childhood. We met in a research methods seminar and bonded over late-night discussions of statistical analysis and experimental design. When he proposed during our final year of graduate school, I said yes without hesitation. We were married the following summer in a small ceremony attended by the friends and family members who had supported me through my journey of healing and growth. My father walked me down the aisle, tears streaming down his face as he whispered how proud he was of the woman I'd become. Mia wasn't invited to the wedding. She was still living quietly in a small town in Ohio, working as a teaching assistant while slowly completing her undergraduate degree. According to my father, who occasionally received updates from Clara, she was doing better. Genuinely better, not just pretending for appearances. She'd been in therapy for years, working through the issues that had driven her to such destructive behavior. She'd never married, never had children, seemed to have devoted herself to a quiet life of service and self-improvement. It was the right outcome for her, I thought. Not the dramatic downfall of a villain in a revenge story, but the slower, more difficult path of genuine redemption. She was learning to live with the consequences of her choices, to build a meaningful life despite the limitations those choices had imposed. As for me, I'd built a life beyond anything I'd imagined possible in either timeline. I was Dr. Elena Martinez now, a respected researcher and clinician who specialized in helping young people overcome family trauma. I'd published papers, spoken at conferences, and developed treatment protocols that were being used in clinical settings around the world. My work was making a difference in the lives of teenagers who were trapped in toxic family situations, giving them the tools and support to survive and eventually thrive. Every young person I helped felt like a small victory over the forces that had once tried to destroy me. On my 30th birthday, David and I hosted a dinner party for our closest friends and colleagues. As I looked around the table at the faces of people who loved and respected me, who valued my contributions to the world, who saw me as a whole person, rather than a victim or a success story. I felt a profound sense of gratitude. I'd been given the rarest of gifts, a second chance at life, and I'd used it not just to escape the circumstances that had once destroyed me, but to transform them into a source of strength and purpose. The girl who had once been so broken that she'd chosen death over life had become a woman who helped others choose healing over despair, growth over stagnation, hope over resignation. I'd turned my pain into power, my trauma into triumph, and my desperation into determination. That night, as David and I cleaned up, after our guests had gone home, I found myself thinking about the essay that had started it all, my analysis of light symbolism in Victorian literature. In my original life, that essay had been the weapon Mia used to destroy my future. In my second life, it had become the evidence that exposed her cruelty and vindicated my innocence. The same piece of work, but with completely different meanings depending on the context in which it existed. It was a perfect metaphor for life itself, how the same experiences could either crush us or strengthen us, depending on how we chose to interpret and respond to them. I'd chosen strength. I'd chosen growth. I'd chosen to use my second chance not for revenge alone, but for the much harder work of building something beautiful from the ashes of my first life. And as I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed beside the man who loved me, in the home we'd built together, surrounded by the life I'd created through my own choices and efforts, I knew that I'd chosen correctly. The girl who had once been a victim had become a victor, but more than that, she'd become herself, fully and authentically and without apology. And that, I realized, was the greatest revenge of all.